The old ranch sat alone on the high plains, a weather-beaten sprawl of fences and warped buildings that had long ago stopped expecting company. Jedediah Cole had worked that land for more than 20 years, and in all that time he had learned the language of the plains, the way the wind whispered through dry grass, how coyotes cried before a storm, how cattle shifted when a predator came too close. That evening, just as the sun bled into the horizon, Jed sensed something was wrong. The animals had gone quiet, not calm, silent. Even the insects seemed to be holding their breath. Jed stepped out onto the porch with his rifle resting against his shoulder. The air felt thick, heavy, like the world was waiting for something to happen. His horses refused to look east, rolling their eyes white and stamping the dirt. Jed followed their gaze toward the far fence line, squinting into the tall grass. At first, he saw nothing but shadows, stretching long and crooked in the dying light. Then the silence deepened, pressing against his ears until his heart sounded too loud. That was when the fence post moved. It didn't snap or crack the way old wood should. It bent slowly, deliberately, as if something heavy leaned against it from the other side. Jed's mouth went dry. His fingers tightened around the rifle stock. He told himself it was the wind, though the air was still as a grave. He told himself not to stare, not to give shape to whatever his fear wanted to see. "Don't! Look there," he muttered, the words barely leaving his lips. But the grass parted. Something stood just beyond the corral, tall and motionless. It had the shape of a man, but it stood wrong, too straight, too still. Jed felt his legs lock, his breath freeze halfway out of his chest. The thing didn't approach. It didn't retreat. It simply waited as if patience were its only purpose. A cloud slid away from the moon. Pale light washed over the figure, and Jed's mind rejected what his eyes showed him. The face staring back was his own. Same narrow jaw, same scar along the cheek from a barbed wire accident years ago. Even the same hollow eyes worn down by the land and time. The only difference was the expression, blank, empty, as though something else wore his skin. Jed tried to scream, tried to move, but his body refused him. The figure tilted its head slightly, studying him in silence. And in that moment, Jed understood with sick certainty that whatever stood beyond his fence had been watching him for a very long time. Jed did not sleep that night. He sat rigid in a chair by the fireplace, the rifle laid across his knees, eyes fixed on the dark rectangle of the cabin door. Every pop of burning wood made his heart jolt. Outside, the plains were quiet again, but it wasn't a natural quiet. It felt staged, like a held breath. Several times he thought he heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and measured, stopping just out of sight. Each time he whispered the same warning to himself, telling his eyes not to wander toward the windows. At first light, Jed saddled his horse and rode hard for town. The familiar trail offered no comfort. Even the sky seemed pale and sickly. Folks noticed the change in him the moment he tied up outside the saloon. Jed Cole had always been a steady man, but now his face was drawn tight, his hands trembling as if the chill had sunk into his bones. Sheriff Amos Reed poured him a drink without a word, watching him over the rim of his glass. "There's something on my land," Jed said finally, voice low and rough. Reed chuckled at first, but the sound died when Jed leaned closer. "It looks like me." The saloon went quiet. Old Martha, seated near the stove, muttered a prayer and made the sign of the cross. She spoke of stories her grandmother used to tell, things that copied men, wore their faces, and waited for a chance to take what they had seen. Reed told Jed to stay in town, but fear drove him harder than sense. By noon, he was riding back toward the ranch, dread riding behind him like a shadow he couldn't shake. When he arrived, the place felt wrong. The barn doors stood open. His horses screamed inside, wild with panic. Jed dismounted slowly, noticing tracks pressed into the dirt. Boot prints. His boots. Each step matched his stride exactly, leading straight into the barn. The smell hit him first, damp, rotten, like earth turned too long. He raised his rifle and stepped inside. The horses broke loose, smashing past him in a frenzy of hooves and dust. As the noise faded, the barn fell into a deep, hollow quiet. Then he heard it, his own voice, soft, calm, close behind him. Don't turn around." Jed's blood went cold as the words settled into his ears. He stood frozen, knowing with terrible certainty that whatever stood at his back was no longer content to watch from beyond the fence. Jed's muscles screamed for him to run, but fear pinned him in place. Slowly, against every instinct he had left, he turned. Standing a few paces away was the thing that wore his face. In the dim barn light, it looked almost perfect. Same height, same shoulders, same weathered skin pulled tight over bone. But the longer Jed stared, the more wrong it became. Its eyes did not blink. Its smile stretched wider than a man's jaw should allow, skin pulling thin as if it had been practiced too often. "I've been watching you," it said, its voice a careful imitation of his own. "Watching how you walk, how you breathe. Took a long time to get it right." Jed raised his rifle and fired. The blast thundered through the barn, but the figure did not fall. The bullet passed through its chest as though it were nothing more than fog. The thing stepped closer, boots sinking into the dirt without leaving prints. The air grew cold, sharp enough to burn his lungs. "You shouldn't have looked," it whispered. "That's how it starts." Jed stumbled back until his shoulders hit the barn wall. His thoughts raced, grasping for prayer, for memory, for anything that could save him. He realized then that the land itself felt different, no longer his, no longer familiar. It was as if the ranch had been waiting for this moment, for him to slip and give whatever lurked beneath the plains permission to cross over. The thing reached out, its fingers bending slightly wrong at the joints. Jed squeezed his eyes shut, refusing to see any more, but it was too late. He felt a crushing weight in his chest, as though something were pulling him inward, peeling him away from himself. The last thing he heard was his own voice breathing calmly, steadily, while his heart thundered in panic. Morning came soft and pale across the plains. When Sheriff Reed arrived later that day, responding to a sick feeling he couldn't shake, he found the ranch silent. The barn stood empty. No blood, no signs of struggle. Jedediah Cole was simply gone. On the barn door, carved deep into the wood, were words cut with shaking hands. "Don't look there." That night, as the sheriff rode back toward town, he glanced toward the old ranch one last time. By the fence stood a lone figure watching him. It looked just like Jed Cole. The man lifted a hand in a slow, familiar wave, smiling faintly. The sheriff spurred his horse and never looked back, unaware that the thing behind him had already learned how to ride. The sheriff did not speak of what he saw that night, but the image followed him into his dreams. Jed Cole standing by the fence, wearing that familiar shape like a borrowed coat, waving as if nothing were wrong. By morning, Reed told himself it had been exhaustion, the mind filling gaps with old fears. Still, he doubled the locks on his door and kept a loaded revolver on the nightstand. The town went on as it always had, dust and routine burying unease. Yet something subtle began to change. Within days, people noticed Jed hadn't truly vanished. A man answering to his name was seen on the outskirts of town, buying supplies, nodding politely, speaking little. He walked stiffly, as if still learning the weight of his body. When spoken to, he stared just a second too long before answering, like he had to search for the right response. Folks shrugged it off. Life on the plains hardened men in strange ways. Sheriff Reed watched him closely. The man wore Jed's face perfectly, yet Reed felt no recognition behind those eyes. They reflected light like still water, offering nothing back. One evening, Reed followed him at a distance as he rode beyond town toward the ranch. The trail grew quiet. Birds scattered. Reed's horse grew uneasy, ears pinned back, refusing to go farther. That was when Reed heard it, soft footsteps behind him, though no one stood there. "Don't look," a voice murmured, not threatening, almost kind. Reed froze. He remembered Jed's words, the warning carved into wood. Slowly he faced forward again, sweat cold on his spine. When he dared to glance back, the trail was empty. But the feeling remained, heavy and watching. That night, screams echoed from the boarding house. Old Martha was found pale and shaking, muttering about a man standing at the foot of her bed, wearing a familiar face, smiling without warmth. She swore he only whispered one thing before fading into the dark. "You saw me." By the end of the week, more sightings followed. Jed at the river, Jed near the schoolhouse, Jed standing in doorways where no one should be. always watching, always waiting. Reed understood then that whatever had taken Jed Cole had not come alone. It had opened something. Out on the plains, beneath the endless sky, more figures began to stand in the tall grass. And one by one, the people who looked for them were never seen again.